In terms of the impact, we have to imagine that a child with a mother like this has to learn to adapt. Instead of a single adaptation, think of this as a set of coordinated defensive solutions. A family, I quote, a family of defensive maneuvers, one might say. The child needs to adapt to, again, what I referred to in that earlier series that I mentioned. They need to adapt to the, and I quote, borderline dilemma. And that's the confusing and chaotic environment where there's no consistent maternal presence. This is where hate, chaos, and confusion come to represent love and connection. So that's right. I know that sounds paradoxical, but yes, chaos, confusion, all of these things suggest connection and love. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, we're returning to our consolidation series, where we slow things down and think more carefully about your questions and comments. Your questions are important, and they become a way for us to revisit and clarify the material we've been working through in our prior episodes. With that in mind, let's move directly into the complexity and begin thinking psychodynamically about your questions and comments. Recently, I received a question from a listener that I want to spend some time with because it really gets at something central. This listener tells us that she is a young adult in therapy who has been reflecting on her own experience and noticing what she described, and I quote, as narcissistic traits. She shared that her mother has a borderline personality organization. And I should say, I've been hearing versions of this from other listeners as well. Questions, for instance, about growing up with a borderline or a narcissistic father. But this particular listener then asked a very important question. Is there a connection? Can growing up with a parent who has a borderline structure shape the development of narcissistic traits in the child? Is there any, and I'm quoting, causal relationship between the two? And if so, is there a reason why a borderline parent might create a narcissistic child? Thanks for the podcast, with several exclamation points expressing great enthusiasm. Rather than thinking about this in a diagnostic way, I want to explore how your early environment may impact and influence your development. This early environment is critical because this is where everything starts. It is within these early relationships that the psyche begins to organize itself, learning how to manage closeness, regulate emotions, develop a sense of self, including identity and internal stability, and make sense out of your needs, your dependency, and connection in general with other people. From a psychodynamic perspective, we don't usually think in terms of a borderline parent, and I quote, causing a narcissistic child in a simple, linear way. Instead, we look at how a child adapts. We look at how a child adapts to their emotional environment as they grow up. In general, I have discussed this in far more detail in a series of episodes I recently released on borderline organization. But in general, a parent with a borderline structure often has intense emotional swings, fear of abandonment or of being left alone, difficulty maintaining a stable, consistent sense of self and others, and moments of deep neediness alternating with withdrawal or anger, to name just a few of the most significant characteristics. All of these factors contribute to a highly unpredictable, unstable, and most likely a chaotic environment. So again, we want to keep our question in mind here. Can growing up in this kind of environment shape which she is now experiencing as, and I quote, narcissistic traits. In a parent with a borderline organization, the emotional environment can swing dramatically. At times, the parent may be intensely close or engulfing. That just means constantly needing to be involved in your feelings, decisions, and daily life. Taking it over, in other words. Perhaps they're seeking reassurance, attention, or emotional validation in ways that can feel overwhelming or suffocating to you. They may pull you too deeply into their own world. They have problems with men, finances, or even conflicts with your father. In either case, the child may feel pressure to anticipate the parent's moods, regulate the parent's emotions, meaning be there to listen to them and manage their distress. Or they may feel pressure to take on responsibilities that are far beyond their age. In other words, they're not age appropriate. At other times, the parent may become dysregulated and even rejecting. They might suddenly pull away without explanation, respond with intense hostility or criticism, or seem emotionally unavailable just when you need comfort or connection. The child may experience this as unpredictable, maybe even frightening. Never quite sure what behavior will elicit care versus criticism or neglect. Love, in this context, can feel conditional, unstable, or overwhelming, available only when the child meets certain expectations, mirrors the parent's emotional state, or sacrifices their own needs. It's a push and pull of closeness and distance, affection and withdrawal, love and hate that can be quite confusing and anxiety-provoking. This shapes the way the child begins to navigate relationships, manage their own emotions, and understand their own needs. A concrete example of this might be a mother who encourages the child to go out, make friends, start dating. But when the child announces plans with a new friend or any new interest, the mother becomes critical, devalues the friend, or says something that subtly or maybe overtly suggests that going out is wrong or dangerous, or why do you need to be out so late, or can't you just have your friends over here? She might say, I just get anxious when you're out. Or in a more extreme case, which actually is more likely with somebody in the borderline range, but in a more extreme case, if you're going out on a date, she may attack your character, calling you, and I quote, a prostitute. I quote that because I actually hear these stories. This can leave the child torn between wanting independence and needing to maintain the parent's emotional equilibrium. And what sort of impact, you have to wonder, might this have on your developing sense of self, the way you feel about yourself, and how you see yourself, and how you see others, and how you imagine others see you? In terms of the impact, we have to imagine that a child with a mother like this has to learn to adapt. Instead of a single adaptation, think of this as a set of coordinated defensive solutions. A family, I quote, a family of defensive maneuvers, one might say. The child needs to adapt to, again, what I referred to in that earlier series that I mentioned. They need to adapt to the, and I quote, borderline dilemma. And that's the confusing and chaotic environment where there's no consistent maternal presence. This is where hate, chaos, and confusion come to represent love and connection. So that's right, I know that sounds paradoxical, but yes, chaos, confusion, all of these things suggest connection and love. Or sometimes a child like this builds a self that doesn't appear to need anyone or tries not to. This kind of adaptive self is likely what the listener has in mind when she describes having, again I quote, narcissistic traits. In other words, this begins to directly speak to her question. Is there a relationship between having a borderline parent and developing narcissistic traits? Because dependency is one of the most dangerous aspects of the dilemma that I just mentioned, the borderline dilemma. You begin to organize yourself, your relationships around self-sufficiency, competence, emotional independence. In other words, when a caregiver is inconsistent and emotionally unavailable, a child may cope by becoming internally self-sufficient, minimizing dependence on others, as if they don't need anybody. What looks like narcissistic grandiosity, aloofness, coldness, or detachment can sometimes be a protective defense against needing someone who may not be reliably there for you. So in other words, this grandiosity, the grandiose structure, is a way to protect yourself from needing someone because you've learned from an early age that this could be very overwhelming or disappointing. But you have to keep in mind, this narcissistic adaptation, the grandiose structure, this is defensive. The narcissistic wall of indifference, the grandiosity, in part, defends against dependency needs that are still very much alive. They're just disavowed or split off, denied, or projected. It's almost as if you, by the way, that's what I mentioned by a family of defenses. And those are some of them: disavowal, splitting, denial, projection, and projective identification. But in any matter, it's almost as if you are saying to yourself, and this may be more or less conscious or unconscious, depending on your level of insight, but it's almost as if you're saying, if I don't need you, you cannot destabilize, disappoint, or take me over. So rather than thinking, my borderline parent made me narcissistic, it's often more accurate and more useful therapeutically to think, I develop certain ways of protecting my self-esteem, my sense of self, and managing relationships in response to an emotionally intense, chaotic, and inconsistent environment. Mother, in this case, with the listener's question. And because the parent is inconsistent, the child cannot integrate a stable image of them. Because the parent is inconsistent, I'm saying this again, this is so critical. I hope this can be understood. The child cannot integrate. Remember, integration is the key to healing with the personality disorders. So because the parent is inconsistent, the child cannot integrate a stable image of them or of themselves. This is where splitting comes in, a fundamental defense in borderline organization. The child experiences the parent as alternating, but they don't just experience them, they do, of course, but the parent alternates as well, a parent with a borderline structure between extremes. That's what I was describing earlier. So when loving and available, the parent can be seen as all good. When rejecting, chaotic, or dysregulated, the parent can be seen as all bad. To manage this, the child may begin to split their own self, identifying with the strong or in control parts, while again disavowing or pushing away the vulnerable, needy aspects of oneself. I hope I'm making this part clear, but this is where the narcissistic structure can begin to take shape. The strong self is maintained and is visible, right? That's the independent self, while the needy self is pushed out of awareness, disavowed, or split off. So there's the splitting again. So the splitting starts in the parent, but this is the overlap now in the narcissistic structure. Of course, there's a fragmented, split sense of self as well, but there's the whole grandiose sense of self that holds that fractured self together. And again, I've spoken about this in far more detail in prior episodes. So now we could start to see a more nuanced answer to the listener's question. Not that a borderline parent, and again, I'm quoting, creates narcissism. It doesn't necessarily work that way, but that this kind of environment can contribute to the development of these defensive patterns. What this listener might be noticing when she talks about her own, and I quote again, narcissistic traits, could be this defensive organization, the parts of the self that are outwardly competent, independent, or self assured, but there's also a more vulnerable, dependent side that remains hidden. This is also where things get a little more complicated because the defensive structure is built to protect the vulnerable parts of the self, but it too can oscillate. When the child, and now the grown adult, feels rejected, overlooked, criticized, or invalidated, those disowned, needy, and I quote, because this is what I hear as I start getting closer to this, as I'm working with these individuals, the bad, vulnerable parts, all of a sudden, they can suddenly resurface. Again, so in the face of a slight or a criticism, the bad, vulnerable parts begin to resurface, often in ways that feel confusing or too overwhelming, and therefore they have to get rid of those feelings. In fact, there's a specific cluster or type of narcissistic presentation that I've discussed in prior episodes, the vulnerable narcissist. This is the pattern where the strong, competent, self-sufficient, right, that self is undermined by feelings of insecurity, shame, passivity, and hypersensitivity to criticism, which could be any kind of feedback. That's the part that you typically see. That's why I said this gets a little complicated, but in the vulnerable narcissistic presentation, you're seeing this other side, this more vulnerable side of the self. And understanding this helps us see that what looks like narcissistic traits is often a sophisticated, protective response to growing up with an inconsistent and emotionally unpredictable caregiver. It's not about the, and I quote again, badness or inherent pathology. It's about adaptation, survival, and the difficult task of managing intense and chaotic early experiences. As we start to bring this episode to a close, I want to acknowledge something important. There's only so much we can infer from a question in isolation, and there's a lot I don't know about your personal experience. Again, I'm speaking to the listener. If I had the opportunity to speak with this young lady directly, I might say something like this, and then ask a few questions to help deepen our understanding. Or I might simply listen closely and see how these themes begin to emerge and how she talks about herself and her relationships. But if I decided to say, instead of just listen and be patient to see how this emerges, I might say to her, and I might let her know that I've been thinking more about her question, and I really appreciate how reflective and curious you're being about your experience with your mother. And it's an important place to start. Before I offer anything more definitive, I want to understand a few things about your experience with your mother, since these details really shape how we make sense of what you're experiencing. One area that I'm curious about, and again, I would initially listen for this in her stories and in her associations, but I might say to her, is one area that I'm curious about is what you mean when you describe identifying with narcissistic traits. That can mean very different things for different people. For example, does it show up more as a sense of being special or different from others, or needing to feel strong, in control, and self-sufficient? Or is it more about feelings of emptiness, hypersensitivity to feedback that feels more like criticism, or difficulty feeling close or comfortable in relationships? Related to that, it would be helpful to understand her experience of need and dependency. Do you find yourself avoiding needing others, or feeling uncomfortable, or even ashamed when you do? What do relationships feel like? Or do relationships ever feel anxiety provoking when they become more emotionally close or meaningful? Do you even allow yourself to get emotionally close, get involved in a meaningful relationship? Oftentimes I hear with these individuals that they haven't had a significant relationship in years, and they're actively trying, perhaps going on dates, but there's rarely ever a second or a third date, because in the initial phase of dating, maybe on that first date, they have already decided there's something that they don't like about this other person. Anyway, ultimately, my response here in this episode is necessarily tentative. I don't have all the details, and every person's experience is unique, but I hope this exploration has shed some light on the ways that growing up with a parent with borderline organization can interact with the development of what you might notice as narcissistic traits. And coming full circle, your original question, whether a borderline parent can, and I quote, create a narcissistic child, isn't something we can answer definitively. What we can see is how the adaptive strategies a child develops in response to an unpredictable, intense, chaotic, and sometimes overwhelming caretaker can look very much like what we think of as narcissistic traits. Okay, everyone, please keep these wonderful and important questions coming. I really appreciate them. Until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.